Welcome to Coaching with Confidence and Care podcast, inspired by common topics that arise in coach training, mentoring, and supervision. I am Dr. Luba Desamidze, the founder of Upthink Coaching. I'm an active coach trainer, mentor, and supervisor. If you are listening, you're probably looking to deepen your skills as a coach. I hope this podcast will be a helpful resource for you and contributes to your journey. Hi coaches! In this episode, I want to talk about the balance of support and challenge in coaching. I have been intentionally working on developing and polishing this coaching style for quite an extended time now, and I'm happy to share my experience and practical tips. Perhaps the image that most people have in mind when they hear the word coach is that of an optimistic cheerleader. Well, just because coaches are always on the client side and look at their strengths and potential, it doesn't mean that this approach excludes challenge. To me, challenge and support are part of the same spectrum, and both can be very developmentally valuable for coaching clients. They are not opposites, and many experienced coaches are able to hold empathy, trust, honesty, and challenge at the same time. Ultimately, I believe it comes down to what serves my client best and what helps them move forward. When I mentor or supervise coaches, I often hear concerns about coming across as too challenging. And I've noticed that for many coaches, challenge is almost synonymous with confrontation in a coaching session. But it doesn't have to be that way. Some of the questions my mentees or supervisees wanted to explore around this topic were: how do I know when a client needs support and when they need to be challenged? How can I challenge a client without damaging the coaching relationship? And if that happens, how do I repair the relationship? What if being too direct could make the client defensive, uncomfortable, or less cooperative, less trusting of me? What does effective challenge actually look and sound like? What kind of questions, observations, or interventions create challenge without sounding judgmental? And how do I know whether I've gone too far or maybe not far enough? I'll address these questions in this episode, and if you have any extra questions, feel free to reach out on social media and we can continue this conversation. First, I want to explain why I chose this approach very intentionally for my own work and why I believe it's important for more coaches to develop the ability to balance support and challenge. As coaches, we work with various clients, and I believe that having a range is important to serve different people at different stages of their process. The decision also comes from my personal experience. When I am a client in coaching, mentor coaching, or supervision, I personally do not require excessive support. Positive strokes are not developmental enough for me. What works for me is when the other person stretches me and challenges my thinking. As a person, I am a high achiever, and challenge makes me think out of the box. Many of my clients are similar, and I am being very transparent about my approach, what I believe as a coach, what my coaching philosophy is. I put that in my coaching bio so that my future clients can see whether or not it's for them. For the purpose of the conversation, let's define what I mean by challenge. Support is kind of clear. Support can show up through demonstrating empathy, deep listening, validation, and acknowledgement. When you say something like, I understand why this feels difficult. Respect for autonomy, when you honor your client's needs in the session. Emotional attunement, normalizing complexity, repairing relational ruptures. For example, by saying something like, I noticed you became quieter after my challenge. What happened for you? Or, I wonder if my question landed differently than I intended. When I say challenge, I never mean confrontation, sarcasm, implying that your clients are not doing a good enough job in their coaching process, or dismissing your client's perspectives. Challenge is an intervention that stretches your client, that serves as a disruption to your client's way of thinking or interpreting their experience. It doesn't mean being rude to the client. It doesn't mean that you do not appreciate or trust the client. So there are no negative attitudes involved. Your client should feel the support at all times of the session. Sometimes I reinforce this by saying, hey, I'm on your side and I'd like to stretch you here, or I'd like to challenge you here. Sometimes I ask them if that would be okay. If I feel a reinforcement is needed, I may remind them that no matter what I say or do, there's no criticism. I know they're capable. I've trust in them. I believe they have the potential to deal with that. And that's exactly the reason why I would love to address something that they're not naming. I also think that there are risks of being too supportive. As coaches, we want to help our clients make a shift. Help doesn't mean always nodding and agreeing with everything that the person says. Sometimes we may be the only people who can tell them the hard truth. Especially when you work with leaders, remember that the higher your client's position is, the less feedback they might be getting, and they may have blind spots that affect the way they lead. I remember working with a client whose company set very ambitious deadlines for the project, and the whole team struggled to meet them. And I asked her, is that plan ambitious or is it delusional? Although the word delusional may sound a bit too strong, that's exactly the word the client needed to hear at that point in order to say, yes, the deadlines are delusional. I need to push back and draw the line between ambitious yet realistic goals and delusional ones. I used a stronger word intentionally in that session to create a disruption. And I knew that we had an amazingly strong bond with a client, and she wouldn't perceive me as being judgmental or criticizing her. Reinforce the atmosphere of safety and show that you actually care about the person in the room or in the call. That is really, really essential. Sometimes you cannot avoid challenge. If you always want to be seen as the nice cop in your client's eyes, that can actually backfire and become a trap. You might find it difficult to step away from that image. And when a challenging situation arises, when you notice something important but don't feel able to say it, it can lead to frustration for both you and your client, and you may get stuck in that session. If you have a fear of being perceived as judgmental, intrusive, rude, or not coach-like when you want to say something more direct, I strongly recommend that you address this in your own supervisions. Generally, whenever you have an inner dialogue, question some of your behaviors, doubt some of your strategies, supervision is really the healthiest way to get this out, to address this, to help you get more grounded and more confident about what you're doing as a coach. I believe it's important that you create productive conditions for your challenge to land well. Remember that effective challenge is a relational act. The same words or the same questions can be experienced as empowering or threatening, depending on rapport, timing, the coach's intention, or the client's readiness. A positive challenge thrives in a supportive space, and in order for your client to move past the discomfort, they shouldn't feel defensive about the conversation. Keep aligning with your client throughout your work together. Alignment is not a one and done thing. You need to keep aligning energetically, emotionally, verbally, semantically, and also relationally. You also shouldn't be thinking that you know better, or that you know what's going on with them, or that you found a solution. And it's important to stay humble in the conversation. You need to be very mindful, intentional, and aware of why you are doing certain things. You need to differentiate between a courageous challenge and a coach simply satisfying their own need to be insightful, useful, or right. When you make a decision about when to challenge, well, I usually make the decision based on my intuition, presence, and perception of what is happening in the conversation with my client and between me and my client, since I use a relational approach in my coaching. My challenge when I sense really connected with a client at that moment, and I feel that the degree of trust is sufficient for the client to tolerate the tension that we might create in this conversation, Depending on the client's personality preferences and the history of our coaching relationship, I might choose to challenge them in a more direct way or maybe more gently. A challenge doesn't always have to feel like someone's pouring a bucket of cold water over their head. So here are some signals that may indicate a challenge could be a productive intervention. Some signals may come from the client's narrative. For example, we are circling in the session without making any progress. This, to me, may be an indication that the conversation is happening at a kind of a shallow level, and we may be avoiding something meaningful that can move the needle. We are not really getting closer to what the client wanted to accomplish, so I might add an intentional disruption here. Sometimes I might introduce a challenge when the client presents assumptions as facts. I notice that the client keeps repeating the same idea as the ultimate truth, although there's a chance it might be just their perception of the situation. Maybe they build their whole narrative on that idea. For example, I'm not good enough. And I might choose to challenge them to help create more options of how the situation can be perceived or how they can perceive themselves. Sometimes the signal may be the dynamics of the conversation. When I notice that the conversation goes kind of stale and we keep going around in circles, if that happens, I might think the client is getting too comfortable and avoids something meaningful. Their thinking process stops and a positive challenge could be helpful. Maybe when a client externalizes all responsibility, that's another opportunity to challenge them. There could be some emotional signals as well. For example, when your client over-explains, avoids certain emotions, minimizes something important, or energy changes around a topic. There could be behavioral signals when there's a clear gap between goals and behavior. When your client makes some commitments without follow-through, especially repeated commitments without follow-through. Maybe when your client turns to you to make decisions for them. There may be some relational signals when you feel like your client is seeking approval, validation, or avoids disagreement. So they are so agreeable in a coaching session, you sense something is not right, something feels off here. Or maybe you sense that you yourself feel pulled into rescuing, advising, or reassuring. And if I sense one of those signals, I will evaluate the dynamics of the conversation. Is the client making progress towards what they wanted to achieve? Are they moving forward in their thinking? Are they accessing something that was not possible for them to access earlier in the conversation? I would then evaluate my relationship with the client, whether the relationship is there for me to stretch them a little bit. What is happening at that moment? Is the client being vulnerable? And then maybe extra stretching is not going to work and going to be counterproductive? Is the client genuinely eager to find the answer, or do they know the answer and they are avoiding it? Overall, how much openness the client has shown previously. If we've had experiences with uncomfortable truths, how well did the client handle that? I would not challenge the client if I sense trust is insufficient. If the relationship cannot yet tolerate challenge may feel like judgment. I would not challenge if a client is experiencing strong emotions. The client is overwhelmed, and I would say one challenge at a time would be productive. If your client is struggling emotionally because of what they're sharing or some of the insights in the session, it may not be a good timing to challenge them even further. Maybe if the client hasn't yet felt understood, it's not a good time to challenge. People usually become more open to challenge after experiencing accurate empathy. And I would definitely not challenge if the challenge serves the coach, not the client. If there are any warning signs in my inner dialogue, something like, I need to tell them the truth. I know what's going on. They need to see this. Or maybe I feel frustrated with the client's pace. It's important not to have your own agenda when you challenge. You cannot challenge a client toward your own version of the truth. Stay curious and invite exploration. Now, let me share some examples of challenges and maybe provide some language for challenges, because I think this is what my listeners often appreciate about the podcast, is that I share some practical examples of the language that they might consider to integrate into their own coaching. But of course, come up with your own language. That would always work best. Maybe after listening to my examples, you'll realize that you actually challenge your clients a lot more than you thought. Challenge doesn't have to use strong words. Even neutral words in the right moment, or even silence in the right moment, can serve as a challenge. Well, some techniques or some approaches to challenging could be naming something directly, naming a contradiction, avoidance, responsibility gap, self-protective strategy, directly but respectfully. For example, your client is saying, I want to become a more courageous leader, but I don't want to upset anyone. And you might say something like, I'm going to challenge you here. It sounds like you want the outcome of courageous leadership without experiencing the discomfort. How possible is that? Or the client says, my team is not taking ownership. And I might say something like, well, sounds like this is only a team problem. What responsibility might your leadership style have in creating this dynamic? Or when the client says something like, I am waiting for the right moment. And I might say something like, I'm wondering if waiting for the right moment has become a way of avoiding a difficult choice. What are your thoughts about this? Another well-known strategy, actually, is addressing discrepancies. For example, you say this goal is a priority, but when we look at your calendar, it receives almost no time. How do you explain that gap? Or you describe yourself as someone who values honesty, yet you are avoiding a conversation you know needs to happen. What do you make of that? Or you say you want more influence, but you are choosing behaviors that keep you invisible. What's going on there? Sometimes you can offer a provocation. This is when you intentionally exaggerate, reverse, or play with the client's position to loosen rigid thinking. And the key here is warmth. Without warmth, it may sound like sarcasm, and you definitely do not want that. For example, a client might say something like, I cannot make a mistake because people will lose confidence in me. And then an example of a provocation could be, so the strategy is never make mistakes, never take risks, and somehow still be seen as a courageous leader? Or the client says, I need more confidence before I act. And the coach might say something like, interesting. So confidence gets to be the gatekeeper, deciding whether you're allowed to move forward. Then addressing accountability might also be a challenge. And it's about moving the client towards ownership and agency. For example, I hear many reasons why this happened. I want to challenge you. What part of the story is yours to own? Or, for example, if you stop waiting for other people to change, what becomes your responsibility? Another way to introduce a challenge might be connecting your client with their emotions. And that is about inviting your client to stop hiding behind competence, logic, or analysis when your client is over-rationalizing. For example, they say, I understand the situation, but I can't do that. But I understand it intellectually. And you say, well, I believe you do. If I asked you to stay with what you feel, not only what you understand, what might emerge? Or you could respond with something like, you're very articulate about the problem. What happens if for a moment you stop being the expert on your own situation? Or even keep it very simple. What feeling are you trying not to feel in this situation? As a coach who likes to use a relational coaching approach, I also like using the coaching relationship as a mirror. And this strategy involves taking a relational risk, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this episode. So for example, your client says, well, everything sounds fine. And you might say, would it be okay for me to share? Sitting with you right now, I experience distance. Does this resonate somehow? Or something is happening between us right now. I feel you moving away from the conversation. I wonder if you feel the same. what might it be telling us about the situation? Or saying something like, part of me is not fully convinced by the story you're telling. Would you be willing to explore what feels incomplete about it? Or, I'm noticing some tension or perhaps a resistance from you when I ask this question. What exactly are you resisting? And remember that your client doesn't have to accept that, right? They can say no to your observations or questions, and that is totally fine. Another way to challenge might be challenging your client's true attitudes through reality testing or addressing assumptions, pattern interruption, etc. with questions like, what are you protecting by holding on to this belief? Or what are you really choosing by not making that decision? Or what conversation are you avoiding that you already know you need to have? Or what is stronger than your desire to change? If nothing changes in 6 months, what role will you have played in that outcome? Or what idea do you have to give up about yourself? Sometimes silence and holding the discomfort can be used for challenging the client. For example, when you refuse to rescue your client from discomfort. Another way of introducing challenge may be naming the defense and challenge the protective strategy itself. It's common in psychodynamic work, but again, you are not diagnosing, right? You're always being curious about that. For example, I wonder if explaining everything so logically is helping you stay away from something. What might that be? Or, I notice humor appears every time we approach something painful. I'm curious what role humor is playing here. Now, any of these questions potentially bear a risk of making your client feel uncomfortable. And therefore, I would qualify them as potential challenges. Of course, challenging clients comes with a relational risk, including the possibility of a rupture. And by a rupture, I mean those moments when your relationship or your rapport with a client might give a crack. I honestly think that a well-managed rupture, a rupture that's not ignored, but is handled in a caring, respectful way, is much, much better for a relationship and client's progress than avoiding it, not naming it, not managing it, or holding back. And I've experienced this multiple times in my practice because I do use challenge extensively, and it happened to me in the past when the client gave me some signals that they were ready for a stretch and they basically consented to being stretched. But when I stretched them, that turned out to be too much for them, and we had to repair that. So you always need to keep your finger on the pulse. If you're sensing something is off, and there could be a risk of rupture, in spite of you reinforcing that you don't really mean to be judgmental, definitely spend some time at the end of the session to talk through what's happened, reinforce your intentions, recontract with the client, how they want to be, handled in the session. Provide support between the sessions if that's part of your work, and at the beginning of the next session, if appropriate, revisit your realigned agreement. In my experience, it's never been a waste because the bond comes first, relationship comes first, and the success of all the other interventions might emerge from that. Keep aligning with your client with phrases like, let me know if this is too much. Let me know if you don't feel like going there. Hey, we can change the direction at any point if it gets too uncomfortable. Always give your client the opportunity to respond to your challenge. Your challenge can start in a very non-directive way. You don't even have to name anything sometimes. I personally always prefer to give my clients an opportunity to notice something themselves if they can. And I might start with broader questions to see if they are actually noticing something in their own story. For example, as you say this, what are you noticing? What may you be avoiding? Is there anything that wants to be named here? I start with this first and I see if they can arrive. But if not, that's okay. I don't insist really. I don't have an agenda and I don't want to come across as if I'm pushing my own agenda because I really don't have one. Last but not least, I probably want to share some ideas about how you can develop your capacity or how you can increase your capacity to balance support and challenge, not just understand it intellectually, if this approach really resonates with you. I trust that our own personal experience matters a lot. And once you experience the value of a courageous conversation or a positive challenge as the client, that will create a buy-in and might provide a good example of how this is skillfully done. So, working with a coach who could be more courageous, direct, or provocative while balancing this with support could give you exactly the experience you're looking for. It can be a coaching or a supervision session. Tell your coach or supervisor what you'd like to experience with them. And then look for examples of how others do that. Reflect on some coaching sessions that were difficult for you. Think what would have changed if you had used more challenge or more direct communication in certain points of those sessions. How might this have changed the course of the session or the client's result or progress or satisfaction? Watch some demo sessions. There are quite a lot of recordings available, and that will also allow you to notice opportunities for being direct and courageous. Think about the language that resonates with you. Think of some tactful and respectful ways to phrase some of those questions. Notice what resonates or does not resonate with you in the way others do that, even maybe with some of the examples that I provided in this episode. Other people may be doing it very organically for themselves, and it may just not sit very well with you, which is okay, because we are all different. Your clients choose you because of the person that you are. When you start to integrate more challenge into your sessions, start with those clients with whom the bond is already strong and you have a great rapport. There are a lot of clients who welcome challenge. Last but not least, stay present, responsive, and attuned to your clients' needs. Even when you master challenging, courageous, or direct conversations, do not overuse them unless this is what serves your client. Do not push this approach just because that's the way you love to work. Always partner with your client about not only what's going to happen next in your session, but how it's going to happen. Well, that's all I wanted to share today. I hope that you'll find the perfect balance of support and challenge that aligns with the coach that you are. If you want to explore that further, you are more than welcome to join me in a supervision session. Before we wrap up, I'd like to give you a glimpse of what's coming in the next episode. We'll be exploring the power of silence in coaching, not just a pause between questions, but as a meaningful intervention that can create space for reflection, deeper awareness, and a different quality of conversation. We'll look at how coaches can use silence intentionally, what makes silence productive rather than uncomfortable, and how staying present in those quiet moments can support clients in accessing insights they might not reach through words alone. You can expect a new podcast episode every other week. During the weeks between episodes, we publish a new episode of our YouTube series, Conversations with Coaches, where I speak with practitioners from different coaching niches and backgrounds. Together, we explore the approaches they bring into their work, the decisions behind their coaching choices, and the realities of what their practice looks like beyond the theory. If you're interested in developing a more relational, interculturally aware, and emotionally informed approach to coaching, one that goes beyond learning techniques and collecting tools, our next cohort of ICF-accredited training programs begins in the fall of 2026. You can find all the details at upthinkcoaching.com or contact me on LinkedIn. I always enjoy connecting with other coaches and practitioners, so feel free to reach out and introduce yourself. And if you're looking for a dedicated space to deepen your reflection, strengthen your coaching presence, and explore your own development as a practitioner, I also offer individual mentor coaching and coaching supervision. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope this conversation gave you something meaningful to reflect on and bring into your own coaching practice. Until next time, take good care.